On this channel we like to look at some really obscure weapons from history from across the world, and here I've got one that you've probably never even seen or heard of before. Do you know what this is? Let's find out. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms, and of course I'm an antique dealer, so sometimes I come across antique items when I'm dealing at collectors' fairs and things like this, or indeed in auction, or sometimes in houses, in people's sheds or lofts, and sometimes I find things that I don't know exactly what they are. Now, at first sight, you can sort of tell what this is. It's got a spike, it's got a hook, it's got a socket, so we know that it probably goes on a pole, and I happen to have a pole here which happens to have, by pure coincidence, the right size end so that I can mount that on a pole. And you can see, once mounted on a pole, this is a rather massive and fearsome looking pole arm. Okay, but because that's not very easy to handle on screen, as you can see, because I'm crashing and banging around, I'm going to take the head off because it's easier to show you guys. So I looked at this thing and I thought, that is awesome. It's well made, so when we're used to seeing whether it's modern replicas or antique items, you can pretty much tell straight away whether something is of quality or not. And frankly, at some periods of history, even though they were using real weapons and using them for real in war, they didn't always make things well. And for example, Chinese Boxer Rebellion swords are often very poor quality because they were massively churned out. But this was clearly of quality, and when I looked at it, I immediately thought that's probably Indo-Persian. Why did I think that? Well, a bit of bias. I'm in Britain, I come across a lot of Indian weapons, and to me it had the look, or it's certainly some similarities to Indian weapons that I've seen in terms of the decorative element there, just sort of halfway down the socket. A very substantial socket, I have to say. So sockets on pole arms can be really quite thin. This is quite substantial, and from about there up, so from about the bottom to there is socket essentially, and from there up is solid steel. We've got a quadrangular, if you want to call it that, or square section. It's not even flattened diamond section, it's a square section spike, very much like a medieval or late medieval and Renaissance Alchspice. So it seems to be armour piercing, that type of square spike. For example, we don't usually find square spikes on like that on areas where there isn't armour involved. And then we've got this curved sickle-like hook, which is edged on the inside and on the outside. Now obviously it's got pitting on it and it's old, so at some point this has been very rusty, and then the rust has been cleaned off, but the rust has eaten a bit into the surface of the metal, as we can see here. So it's got pitting, but despite that pitting, it's still incredibly solid and sound, and if you tap the blade you can tell that it's well heat treated, or certainly is heat treated. It's not soft iron. But also this blade down here, like a little sickle, is still quite sharp, front and back, and very well formed. And if we just look at the form of the forging between the two things there, where they sort of divide, it's very finely done. So it's a good quality pole arm with a spike and a hook, and obviously the first thing we think of are bill hooks, European medieval and Renaissance bills, and this has some parallels to it, but I've never seen a European one that really looks exactly like this. So what is it? Well, in trying to work out what this thing was, the first thing I started doing was I consulted the tomes of wisdom, books on Indian weapons and North African weapons, Middle Eastern weapons, Japanese weapons, Chinese weapons, and eventually I worked out what it was. Now at this point, can you guess? Post down below, can you guess what this is and where it's from at least? And I have to say, it really surprised me. I genuinely thought that it would be Indian or Indo-Persian. However, I was completely wrong. It is Chinese. So I'm unfortunately not able to say Chinese except to say ni hao and a few other random words like dao and yen associated with weapons or time periods. However, I worked out that what this is called, and I'm going to read it, is a Golien Chang. I think that's pronounced correctly. Chinese viewers, I know I've got lots of people watching from China. Am I pronouncing that right? So Golien Chang. Okay, I'm just going to call it a Golien. Golien, I think it's pronounced. So, the Golien Chang. Now, Chang just means spear, as I understand it, and I think lian means the sickle. So let's call this a sickle spear, because that's more or less what the Chinese means, I believe. So the Gulian Chang. I have real problems with that name. So it's a sickle spear. So fundamentally, this is a type of weapon, after some research later I have learned. This came about, we don't really know actually, it came about in what by European standards would be the early medieval period. But by the Song dynasty, it was a really popular weapon. So we're talking 10th to 13th century by BC and AD dating. Okay, so 10th to 13th century, Song dynasty, really popular weapon. Now, much like the European billhook, which became popular in the late medieval period and through into the Renaissance, this gives us a range of options. So fundamentally it's a spear, but this is a very particular type of spear. Bear in mind that in China, in the Song dynasty or Ming dynasty, any other period, most spears are somewhat leaf-shaped head, like how you typically think of a spear. But this is more like an alchpiece, and this is because during the Song dynasty and indeed the Ming dynasty, they were wearing lots of armour. They were, and the various other people they were fighting as well. So when there's lots of armour involved, we always end up with these sorts of spikes, exactly like you would find on the top of a poleaxe or a rondel dagger or various types of lance and pike. This is an anti-armour spike, which might help us with dating this. We'll come back to dating this particular one a little bit towards the end of the video. But essentially you've got a long square section like a bodkin piercing point. But then you've got this hook. Now this is very interesting, and it's very similar, as I say, to European bill hooks, for example. But this is not particularly big and choppy. Now, whilst it could be swung to spike, in my opinion, compared to other Chinese weapons, some of which come out more like a war pick or a war hammer, this isn't really that. This is more for hooking. Now, it does seem, looking at the sources, that these hooks were used in a number of different ways. They were used against other infantry to hook bits of their equipment, armour, or indeed bodies. Also to hook shields. So, for example, you can, if you're extending this thing out over a shield wall, you can pull the shield in and then stab behind. Very, very useful. Also very useful against horses and pulling horsemen off of horses, or indeed actually hooking around the leg or around the neck of the horse to cause it discomfort or wound it or bring it down. So these are incredibly useful against all sorts of people on foot, standard infantry, but also cavalry. But a couple of other uses that these, and billhooks incidentally, share, is these are really useful in siege warfare, where you're dealing with either trying to protect your fortification against people who are scaling walls, or perhaps when you're attacking people who are on walls. So whether it's pulling someone off something or whether it's pushing something away. And of course, a lot of people look at hooks like this and only think about pulling, but there you've also got a really good pushing junction. Now you'll notice I mentioned this is edged in both ways. It is edged on the front and it's edged on the back, which is true of many European bills as well, which means that of course you can offend by punching forwards with it, or by raking backwards with it. And of course this can be used against people, also against ladders, in any kind of siege situation. And the other very important situation, which often gets overlooked by people like me, who spend most of our time on land, naval, okay, on boats. And it should be no surprise that there is a very common object which you can go into a shop and buy today called a boat hook. So any kind of pole with a hook on it is useful on a boat. It's useful for pulling boats closer if you want to board. So if your ship comes up next to the other and you've got a load of people with these sickle spears, as well as attacking the people on the other ship, you can also try and pull the two ships close together for boarding. But equally, that can be used obviously against people, but it can also be used against rigging and ropes and, as I say, ladders, any kind of device which might be used for either defending your ship or getting on board another ship. You can even climb with these things because you can hook it over the top of a fence or a wall, for example, and pull yourself up. So incredibly versatile and useful. Now, if we come a little bit forward in time from the Song dynasty to the Ming dynasty, which is the equivalent of the late medieval and early Renaissance period in Europe, in fact, the time when bill hooks were really popular in warfare, particularly in places like England and Italy, these were popular once again against a very specific opponent. And there was a commander called Huan Zhou. I'm sure my pronunciation is terrible, but Huan Zhou was famous for using a certain type of cavalry formation involving cataphracts. That's right, armoured horses. But rather than just being normal armoured horses, they were armoured horses chained together. I think usually in groups of 3 or 4, perhaps 4 was the normal one. So in other words, the Ming were fighting against these chained together cataphracts, which are kind of like a chariot, sort of, I guess, to deal with. And they found, and in fact we see it in art, that these type of sickle spears were very useful at messing up those particular opponents. These were used against them, and of course they could be used obviously for stabbing horses or just like a pike block opposing, but they could also be used to pull riders off, pull horses apart, even to cut through reins and connecting things. So these were a really good weapon, not just against standard cavalry, but even against cataphracts, where you might not be able to stab them but you can pull them off. Or potentially even against chariots or similar sorts of formations. Now these weren't only used in the equivalent of the medieval period, so Song dynasty, Ming dynasty, but after that we go into the Qing dynasty, which comes all the way up to the Boxer Rebellion in the early 20th century. And these were still being used then, but they're mostly associated, although they were still around generally and probably could be used by anyone, they were particularly associated with the Green Standard Army. Now, what is the Green Standard Army? Well, I'm not going to go into an in-depth history because it's quite complicated, but fundamentally they started out in the early Qing dynasty during the conquest period, and they were mostly made up of ethnic Han soldiers, but also they absorbed, for example, Muslim converts and various people who were, generally speaking, economically quite low on the ladder, so quite poor soldiers and not fantastically equipped. So what they did is they gave them these sickle spears because they were a good, relatively cheap weapon that made them far more potent on the battlefield than they would have been otherwise. Now what's interesting is the Green Standard Army then morphed into essentially a police force, a bit like a gendarmerie. So if you think about gendarmes who are basically armed police, that's basically what the Green Standard Army became, and they were still that at the time of the Boxer Rebellion. And they were famously associated with this weapon. Now I should mention at that point, of course, they did also have swords as backup weapons and various other things, but they were known for these sickle spears specifically. And in fact, probably partly because of that, but probably because they were still around and being used from the Song dynasty through the Ming dynasty into the Qing dynasty, they were very useful and popular and versatile weapons. We also find that there are existing kung fu forms, methods of use and movements and patterns actually still in Shaolin Kung Fu. So you can actually literally go and learn Shaolin Kung Fu, and this is one of the weapons which we still have surviving forms for. So the final question is about this particular piece of metal in my hands. It's clearly a genuine sickle spear from China. The question is, when does it date to? Well, I have found various other examples. I found one which sold in auction which looked quite similar to this. I found one just on a website, and I don't know the source of where that original was from, but it looked very similar to this, except it had 2 decorative bands on the socket instead of 1. And I also found an example of one that had been sold privately from someone's collection that looked quite similar to this also, but in better condition. The question is, how old is this? Well, I actually found some photographs of these being used at the time of the Boxer Rebellion. So for those of you who don't know, without going into a huge amount of depth, the Boxer Rebellion was something that happened at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, where a 7-nation army, a mixture of Europeans and also Japanese as well, basically invaded China because they didn't like the way that things were going in China. So it was essentially gunboat diplomacy. And there was a big old war for a year or so. There was an embassy siege and all sorts of things I won't go into. But fundamentally, the Chinese forces were very numerous, but very poorly equipped and trained. So during that war, a lot of artifacts from the Boxer Rebellion period came back to Europe and America because they were brought as souvenirs at the end of the war. So a lot of Chinese weapons which we find like here in Britain, for example, or indeed in America or Canada or Australia or any European country, and probably even Japan as well, came from China during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 or 1901 thereabouts. Is this one of those? It's possible, and we have to bear in mind that during the Boxer Rebellion, because huge numbers of Chinese troops were just equipped with whatever was available and very cheap spears and swords were being churned out, but they would have used every antique they could lay their hands on, it's entirely possible this was carried in the Boxer Rebellion and brought back to Britain as a result of the Boxer Rebellion and as a souvenir. However, my opinion, based on ones of that era, so sickle spears and other spears that I've seen of the Boxer Rebellion era, this is probably older than that. How old? I don't know. Is it Song Dynasty? Is it 10th to 13th century? I think it's unlikely. Is it Ming Dynasty? It could be. It could be Ming Dynasty, or it could be early Qing Dynasty. So I think in reality we're probably looking at an example here, I would say, and again we come back to the spike, which dates from a time when armour was still fairly prevalent. So when we look at the Boxer Rebellion era of these, they tend to have more leaf-shaped spearheads because people aren't wearing armour anymore by the 1800s, because gunpowder is very effective. But they're still wearing armour in the, obviously in what's the equivalent of the Middle Ages in Europe, but going through the 14, 15, 16, and even into the 1700s, we still see, for example, Manchus are still basically have heavy cavalry on horseback and still using bows and stuff. So this could be from the 14, 15, 16, 1700s. I don't think, because of the nature of this armour-piercing point, that it's from the 1800s. I think it probably pre-1800. But anyway, a fantastic thing. And as always, one of the things I love about antique collecting and antique dealing is you find something, you don't know what it is, you work out what it is, and in the process, you learn lots of history that you never knew before, and possibly you never would have known if you hadn't found that object and wanted to know the history of that object and where it came from. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope this has been interesting. I have been Matt Easton and will of course continue to be. Please make sure you're subscribed. Give me a like if you found this an interesting or educational video, and I hope to see you back on the channel really soon. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.